We stayed married for the kids, and then something unexpected happened. People think staying married is a single decision, made once, like signing a contract and filing it away. But the truth is, staying married is something you choose again and again, sometimes daily, sometimes hourly, especially when love has thinned into something fragile and unfamiliar. I used to think my husband and I were a success story simply because we endured. We had been married for a long time, long enough that the sharp edges of passion had dulled into routines, long enough that our arguments no longer surprised us, only exhausted us, long enough that silence had become our most fluent language. And yet we stayed. Not because we were happy, not because we were in love the way people imagine love should be. We stayed married for the kids. I remember the exact moment that decision became unspoken law between us. We never announced it, never sat down and declared it out loud. It just happened. Somewhere between late-night arguments whispered behind a locked bedroom door and early mornings, packing lunches side by side without making eye contact. We became partners in logistics, co-managers of a household, two adults orbiting the same responsibilities without touching. My husband was a good father. That was never in question. He showed up. He coached, attended, repaired, provided. He did the things that mattered on paper. And I was a good mother. I kept schedules, soothed fears, noticed emotional shifts before anyone else did. Together, we made a functional unit. But somewhere along the way, we stopped making a marriage. At night, we lay on opposite edges of the bed, the space between us like a border neither of us had permission to cross. I would listen to my husband breathe and wonder if he was awake too, staring into the dark with thoughts he no longer shared with me. We didn't fight anymore, not really. Fighting required energy. Fighting required hope that something might change. Instead, we negotiated, calmly, carefully, like diplomats preserving a fragile ceasefire. The kids never knew, or at least we told ourselves they didn't. We smiled in photos. We sat together at school events. We laughed at the right moments. From the outside, we were solid, stable, safe. Inside, I felt like I was slowly disappearing. There were days I'd catch my reflection in the bathroom mirror and barely recognize the woman looking back at me. She looked tired, yes, but more than that, she looked paused, like someone who had pressed stop on her own life while everyone else kept moving. Sometimes I wondered if my husband felt the same way. Sometimes I wondered if he felt anything at all. Years passed like this, not dramatically, quietly, which in its own way was more frightening. Then came the night everything shifted. It was an ordinary evening, dangerously ordinary. Homework sprawled across the table, dinner dishes stacked in the sink, the kids arguing over something trivial that felt monumental to them. My husband and I exchanged glances, the silent teamwork of parents who had done this dance 1,000 times. After the kids went to bed, my husband lingered in the kitchen longer than usual. I noticed because routine was our currency, and deviations stood out. He didn't reach for his phone. He didn't turn on the television. He just stood there, hands braced on the counter, staring at nothing. I asked him if something was wrong. He didn't answer right away. When he finally looked at me, his expression wasn't angry or distant. It was unsettled, as if he were standing at the edge of something he hadn't planned to see. "I need to tell you something," my husband said. Those words landed heavier than I expected, not because of what they usually mean, but because of how rarely he said them anymore. I nodded, suddenly aware of my heartbeat. He told me he had been cleaning out old boxes in the garage earlier that day, boxes neither of us had touched in years, childhood memorabilia, paperwork, things we'd shoved into corners and forgotten. In one of those boxes, he'd found something that wasn't supposed to be there. Something addressed to him, something old. Something that had never been opened. At first, I didn't understand why his voice sounded the way it did, why his hands were shaking just slightly as he spoke. Then he told me what the envelope was. It was a letter. From me. Dated years ago. Written during a time I barely remembered. An exhausted, emotional season when the kids were younger and the cracks in our marriage were just beginning to show. A letter I never remembered sending. A letter he had never read. The room felt smaller suddenly. I tried to speak, but nothing came out. My husband told me he opened it that afternoon, standing alone in the garage, dust in the air, sunlight cutting through the open door. He said he read it once, then again, then a third time. He said it changed something. That was when fear crept in. Not loud, not dramatic, but quiet and cold. Because I didn't remember what I had written. And the look on my husband's face told me whatever was in that letter wasn't small. He asked me if I remembered writing it. I shook my head. He studied me carefully, like he was seeing me for the first time in years, or maybe like he was realizing he never truly had. The thing is, my husband said slowly, you wrote it like you didn't expect us to still be married. My stomach dropped. He told me the letter wasn't angry. It wasn't cruel. It was honest, painfully honest. A snapshot of a woman who felt lonely inside her own marriage. A woman who loved her children deeply but felt herself fading away. A woman who was planning for a future she wasn't sure included her husband. I felt exposed in a way I hadn't in years. Not because he was accusing me, but because he was listening. Really listening. And then my husband said something I never expected to hear. I think, he said, voice tight, I stayed married for the kids, but I don't think I ever realized how much you were surviving, not living. The silence that followed was deafening. For the first time in years, we weren't avoiding the truth. We were standing in it. And neither of us knew what would happen next. That night, neither of us slept. We lay in the same bed we had shared for decades, but the air between us felt charged, unfamiliar. The past had quietly stepped out of its hiding place and taken a seat beside us, refusing to be ignored any longer. I kept replaying my husband's words in my mind. You wrote it like you didn't expect us to still be married. What had I been feeling then? So certain, so resigned, that I'd put it into words and sealed it in an envelope. Sometime before dawn, I finally spoke. I want to read it, I said into the darkness. My husband turned toward me. I could feel his hesitation, the way he weighed whether this was a door better left closed. But after everything we had buried for years, the idea of hiding felt pointless. He got up, walked quietly out of the room, and returned with the envelope. The paper was yellowed, edges softened by time. My handwriting stared back at me, familiar, yet distant, like a voice from another life. I opened it. The first line alone made my throat tighten. If you're reading this, then something has already changed. I had written the letter as if I were speaking to a future version of my husband, or maybe to myself. I described feeling invisible, like I was slowly erasing myself to keep the peace. I wrote about staying because leaving felt like tearing the kids in half, even though staying felt like tearing myself apart. I wrote about how I missed him. Not the man he was now, but the man he used to be. The one who laughed easily. The one who looked at me like I was more than a problem to be managed. And then came the part that made my hands tremble. I had written that I was afraid one of us would wake up one day and realize it was too late, that we'd sacrificed so much of ourselves for the kids that there'd be nothing left when they no longer needed us. Tears blurred the words. I glanced at my husband. His face was unreadable, but his eyes were wet. I didn't know you felt that alone, he said quietly. The truth was, neither did I anymore. That version of me felt like a stranger, yet her pain was unmistakable. We talked until the sun came up, not arguing, not defending, just talking. It felt awkward at first, like learning a language we'd both forgotten. But slowly, something softened. We admitted things we'd never said aloud, resentments, regrets, quiet disappointments. The ways we'd both felt unchosen, unappreciated, misunderstood. For the first time in years, my husband reached for my hand, not out of habit, but intention. That should have been the unexpected thing. But it wasn't. The unexpected thing came weeks later. Life didn't magically fix itself after that night. We didn't suddenly fall back into love. What changed was subtler and more dangerous. We became curious again. We started noticing each other, asking questions, sitting together after the kids went to bed instead of retreating into separate corners of the house. Sometimes it felt hopeful. Sometimes it felt terrifying. Because curiosity leads to truth. And truth doesn't always bring comfort. One afternoon, my husband came home earlier than usual. I could tell immediately something was wrong. His movements were stiff, controlled, like he was holding something back. He told me he'd run into someone at work. Someone from our past. A woman whose name I hadn't heard in years. My chest tightened before he even finished speaking. She was someone he had known during one of the hardest periods of our marriage. Someone who had been around just enough back then to make me uneasy, though I'd never had proof of anything inappropriate. She told me something, my husband said. He hesitated, and in that pause, my mind raced through every possible scenario. She said there was a moment, he continued, when I almost left. The room tilted. Not for her. For himself. He told me that years ago, right around the time I'd written the letter, he had seriously considered walking away. He hadn't cheated. He hadn't crossed any lines, but emotionally, he had been standing right at the edge. I didn't leave, my husband said, because of the kids and because I was scared, but I never told you how close I came. The honesty hurt more than a lie would have. Because suddenly, the letter wasn't one-sided. We had both been surviving quietly, carrying our own versions of almost leaving. That night, after the kids were asleep, I went into the garage alone. I didn't know what I was looking for until I found it. Another box. Another envelope. This one in my husband's handwriting. Addressed to no one. Dated around the same time as my letter. My hands shook as I opened it. Inside was a letter he'd never sent, never shared, never destroyed. In it, he wrote about feeling like a stranger in his own home, about wanting to be seen not just as a provider, but as a person, about loving me, but not knowing how to reach me anymore. And at the end, he wrote something that made my breath catch. I don't know if staying is the brave choice, or the easy one. I sat there on the cold concrete floor for a long time, the weight of years pressing down on me. We had both been standing still, convinced we were doing it for the kids, never realizing how close we'd come to losing everything anyway. When I finally went back inside, my husband was waiting. I handed him the letter. He didn't say a word, just read it, then slowly sat down, his face in his hands. That was the moment something truly unexpected happened. We didn't collapse. We didn't separate. We chose something harder. We decided to stop surviving. Not for the kids. For ourselves. Choosing to stop surviving sounds noble when you say it out loud. In practice, it's terrifying. Once my husband and I admitted how close we'd both come to leaving, how we'd each written goodbye letters to futures that never happened, we couldn't go back to pretending. The old routine no longer fit. Silence felt dishonest now. Distance felt deliberate. So we tried something neither of us knew how to do anymore. We tried to be real. It started small, painfully small. We went for walks after dinner while the kids did homework, talking about neutral things at first. The neighborhood, work, memories from before parenthood swallowed everything. Sometimes we'd laugh, surprised by the sound, like it didn't belong to us anymore. Other times, we'd say the wrong thing and retreat into ourselves, old habits snapping back like rubber bands. There were nights when my husband would reach for me, then hesitate, unsure if the gesture would be welcomed or rejected. There were nights when I wanted closeness so badly it hurt, but fear kept me still. Fear that trying again would only remind us of what we'd lost. Rebuilding wasn't romantic. It was awkward, slow, uneven. And then came the moment that nearly undid everything. It happened on an ordinary Tuesday, the kind that never announces its importance until afterward. The kids were at school. My husband was working from home. I was folding laundry when his phone buzzed on the counter. He was in the shower. I wasn't snooping. I didn't pick it up with suspicion or intent. I only glanced because the screen lit up with a name I didn't expect to see. The same woman, the one from work, the one from the past. My chest tightened. I told myself not to overreact. That honesty didn't mean immunity from fear. That curiosity could still coexist with trust. But the message preview burned into my mind. I didn't mean to open old wounds. I just thought you should know how I felt back then. I stood there longer than I should have. When my husband came out of the bathroom, towel around his waist, he froze when he saw my face. "What's wrong?" he asked. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't accuse. I just held up the phone. "I need you to tell me the truth," I said. "All of it." He sat down slowly, like a man bracing for impact. He told me she had reached out after their unexpected encounter, that she'd been thinking about the past, that she'd apologized for the emotional closeness they once shared. He told me he hadn't replied yet, not because he was hiding anything, but because he didn't know how. "I don't want secrets anymore," my husband said, "even harmless ones." I believed him. But belief didn't erase the ache in my chest. Because trust, once cracked, doesn't heal just because you want it to. That night, we argued for the first time in years. Not carefully, not politely. It was messy, emotional, raw. I told my husband how scared I was, that reopening our marriage meant reopening wounds I wasn't sure I could survive. That staying for the kids had been easier than risking my heart again. He told me how much pressure he felt now to fix something he hadn't even realized was broken for so long. How terrified he was of failing twice, once as a husband and again as a man trying to change too late. We didn't resolve it that night. We went to bed angry, backs turned, the familiar space between us returning like an old enemy. And for the first time since reading the letters, I wondered if we had made a mistake. The next few weeks were fragile. Some days felt hopeful, others felt unbearable. Then came the phone call that changed everything. It was the school. Our youngest had collapsed during gym class. Those minutes, the drive, the waiting, the helplessness, stripped everything else away. Sitting in that sterile hospital room, watching my husband pace, his face pale with fear, I felt something sharp and undeniable cut through me. This was the man I wanted beside me when the world fell apart. When the doctor finally told us our child would be okay, that it had been a scare, not a tragedy, my legs nearly gave out with relief. My husband grabbed me then. Not gently, not cautiously. He held me like he might lose me too. And in that moment, something unexpected happened. I realized I wasn't afraid of losing the marriage anymore. I was afraid of losing him. Not the version of my husband who existed only as a co-parent, but the man who stood shaking in a hospital hallway, desperate and human, and still deeply connected to me. That night, after the kids were asleep, we sat together on the couch, exhausted and quiet. "I don't want to stay married just for the kids anymore," I said softly. My husband looked at me, eyes tired but clear. "Neither do I." We talked about therapy, about rebuilding trust deliberately, not accidentally, about what it would mean to choose each other, not out of obligation, but intention. And then my husband told me something that stunned me. "I was planning to leave once the kids were grown," he admitted. "I thought that was the kindest way, give them stability now and freedom later." The words hurt, but the honesty mattered more. "I don't want that future anymore," he said. "Not if there's a chance for something real." That was when I understood the truth we'd been avoiding for years. Staying for the kids hadn't saved our marriage. It had only postponed the reckoning. We started therapy the following month. Saying that sentence still feels strange, like admitting to something deeply private. Therapy wasn't a dramatic turning point. It was more like opening a door to a room we'd avoided for decades, only to find it cluttered with unspoken grief, resentment, and longing. The therapist didn't let us hide behind the kids. Every time one of us tried to explain our choices through them, she gently redirected us. "What do you want?" she'd ask. At first, neither of us had an answer. We had spent so many years shaping our lives around what was practical, responsible, and safe that desire felt like a foreign concept. Wanting something for ourselves felt selfish, dangerous. But slowly, we began to speak. I admitted I was angry that I'd given so much of myself to keep the peace. Angry that my husband hadn't noticed how lonely I'd been. Angry that by the time we finally faced the truth, so much time had already passed. My husband admitted he felt like he'd failed me long before either of us acknowledged it. That he'd buried his own needs because he believed sacrifice was the price of being a good father and husband. That he'd confused endurance with love. Those sessions were exhausting. Some days we left feeling closer. Other days we left raw and distant, wounds reopened with no immediate relief. Then came the unexpected offer. My husband was approached at work about a promotion. A significant one, more money, more responsibility. But it came with a catch. We would have to move. Far away. At first, it sounded like a fresh start. A chance to redefine ourselves somewhere new, free from the ghosts of our past routines. But the reality settled in quickly. The kids were rooted here. Friends, schools, a life we'd built even if the marriage within it had been fractured. And beneath all of that was a quieter fear, one neither of us said out loud at first. What if the move only delayed the truth again? Late one night, after hours of circling the topic, my husband finally asked the question we'd both been avoiding. "If we move," he said, "are we running towards something or away from ourselves?" I didn't answer right away, because I wasn't sure. Then, as if the universe wasn't finished testing us, the woman from his past reached out again. This time, my husband showed me immediately. The message was longer, more personal. She spoke about regrets, about wondering what might have happened if circumstances had been different, about how seeing him again had stirred something she thought she'd buried. Reading it hurt, but it also clarified something I hadn't expected. I wasn't angry at her. I was afraid of losing the fragile honesty my husband and I had built. My husband didn't hesitate. He told her clearly that he was committed to repairing his marriage, that revisiting the past wasn't something he was willing to do. He blocked her after that. Not because I asked him to, because he chose to. That choice mattered more than any promise. Still, the tension lingered. The promotion, the move, the realization that rebuilding didn't mean safety, it meant risk. Then came the diagnosis. It started with small things. Fatigue my husband brushed off, pain he ignored. Tests we assumed were precautionary. Until they weren't. Sitting in that doctor's office, hearing words that didn't seem real, I felt the floor drop out from under me. It wasn't immediately life-threatening, but it was serious. Serious enough to force us to confront something we hadn't dared to name yet. Time. The promotion was put on hold. The move became irrelevant. Suddenly, the future wasn't something we planned. It was something we hoped for. The kids took it harder than we expected. Seeing their fear stripped away any remaining illusion we'd been holding things together for their sake alone. They needed us. Not as a stable structure, but as present, honest parents. The nights during treatment were long, quiet. My husband was more vulnerable than I'd ever seen him, stripped of strength, control, certainty. One night, as I sat beside him, he reached for my hand and said something that shattered me. "I'm glad we didn't wait," my husband whispered. "I'm glad we didn't wait until it was too late to try." In that moment, I understood the unexpected truth we'd been circling for years. Staying married for the kids had kept us together. But choosing each other, now imperfectly, fearfully, was what gave our marriage meaning again. We didn't know how much time we had. But for the first time in decades, we weren't wasting it. The months that followed were some of the hardest and most honest of our marriage. Illness has a way of stripping life down to its essentials. There was no room left for pretense, No energy for resentment carefully stored for later. Every day became a decision. How we would show up for each other, for the kids, and for ourselves. I watched my husband change. Not dramatically, not in grand gestures, but in quiet ways that mattered more. He listened differently. He apologized without defending himself. He let himself be afraid in front of me, something I hadn't realized I'd needed to see all those years. And I changed too. I stopped shrinking. I stopped measuring my worth by how much discomfort I could endure without complaint. I spoke when something hurt. I asked for closeness instead of hoping he'd guess. The kids noticed. They noticed us sitting closer on the couch, laughing again, holding hands in the hospital waiting room. They didn't ask many questions, but one night our oldest said something that stayed with me. "You guys feel different," they said carefully. "Like more here." I realized then that staying married for the kids had given them structure. But choosing to love each other again was giving them something far more valuable. A model of what honesty looks like. The diagnosis didn't define the ending the way we feared it might. Treatment was brutal but effective. Recovery was slow, uncertain, and humbling, but it came. And in the quiet after the crisis passed, something unexpected happened. We grieved. Not the marriage we almost lost, but the years we had. We mourned the time spent surviving instead of living. The conversations never had. The affection withheld out of fear or exhaustion. The versions of ourselves we had paused for the sake of stability. But grief, when shared, didn't separate us. It bonded us. One evening, long after the kids were asleep, my husband and I sat outside, watching the sky darken. He turned to me and said something that surprised us both. "I don't regret staying," he said. "Even the hard parts, but I regret thinking that staying was enough." I nodded. "We thought endurance was love," I said, "but it was just fear wearing responsibility's face." We didn't pretend everything was perfect after that. Some habits are stubborn, some wounds leave scars, but our marriage no longer felt like a waiting room. It felt alive. Years later, when the kids were grown and the house was quieter than we'd imagined it would be, my husband and I found ourselves in that space we once feared, the after. And it wasn't empty. It was full of late-night conversations, shared memories, inside jokes no one else would ever understand, a love that wasn't loud or cinematic, but deeply earned. We had stayed married for the kids. And then something unexpected happened. We finally learned how to stay married for each other. Not because we had to, but because, after everything, we wanted to. And that choice, made late, imperfectly, honestly, turned out to be the most meaningful one of all.